Hi. we- Hi, welcome everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Forum Europe's second cybersecurity salon, where we'll be discussing the EU's 5G toolbox. Today's title is Improving Diversity of Supply, Securing the 5G Environment, so I'm sure we will have plenty to discuss. This series of panels is organised around the annual security summit, which took place online, alas not in Brussels, earlier this month. Following on from the summit, the aim is to have a more nuanced discussion of the big strategic questions in the cybersecurity sector and digital economy more generally. The aim is to bring in new perspectives, including those from the academic and think tank world, and explore ideas and insights from outside the regular Brussels bubble that relate to the issues currently unfolding here. The session is public, so don't hesitate to tweet your thoughts using the hashtag CyberSalon, and we will be taking questions from the floor in the panel later. Today, we're going to talk about the EU's 5G toolbox with its implementation around Europe, how that's going, and what we can expect going forward. With worldwide 5G revenues to reach an estimated 225 billion in 2025, 5G technologies and services are a key asset for Europe to be able to compete in the global market. Yet when it comes to who supplies and operates that infrastructure, there are lots of questions, and the future is far from clear. The toolbox aims to identify a possible common set of measures which are able to mitigate the main cybersecurity risks of the 5G network. But is the toolbox the right tool for the job? An update was due in October, and that hasn't yet materialised because, let's face it, 2020 is quite a year. So hopefully we can bounce a few ideas around which will fill the gap for those of you who are eagerly awaiting the update. We'll also take a look at 5G security more generally, in particular, what needs to be taken into account with regards to emerging post-5G technologies. Is Europe ready for the global scramble for quantum supremacy? Can the continent compete on AI without a strong 5G network? And let's face it, it's a Brussels crowd, so nobody can resist a discussion about interoperability. We'll touch on Open RAN as well. We've got a great panel here today to discuss things, so let me announce them. They should pop up into the feed one by one. We have got Michelle van Bellegem, who's the incoming chair of BEREC, who's going to make some opening remarks for us as well. We've got Eva Tasheva, who's the co-founder and cybersecurity lead at CYEN, a family-owned cybersecurity consultancy. They advise large public and private sector organisations on cyber issues. Art Pranayal is a professor in the Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography sorry, I can't talk this morning, and Industrial Cryptography Research Group at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And Adrian Scrays is Chief Technical Officer at ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, and Head of Mobile Competence at 3GPP, the third generation partnership project. So he's got a couple of relevant hats that he can wear for us this morning. We're going to start by setting the scene with some opening remarks from Michel. He's the incoming chair of BEREC, the body of European telecoms regulators, which I'm sure you're all more than familiar with. And he's also the chair of the Belgian regulatory body, the BIPT. Michael, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis. I hope you can hear me well. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to provide the opening remarks at this webinar about the 5G toolbox. New technologies such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and 5G will play a key role in our digital economy and society in the years to come. For us at BEREC, the European body that is composed of national telecom regulators, one of our key priorities is to ensure that the very high capacity networks and 5G services are available on a timely manner. And BEREC is mindful of what is still needed to achieve the Gigabit 2025 objectives and will continue to promote the rollout of 5G and fiber. With the rise of new technologies, increasingly complex cross-border and cross-sectoral security threats have emerged. The COVID-19 pandemic confirmed the vulnerability of certain critical infrastructure, as hospitals and health institutions, for instance, were targeted. This requires adequate efforts to protect key infrastructure from any form of disruption and build up their resilience both online and offline. We in BEREC are experts in telecommunications markets, but not necessarily in cybersecurity. Few BEREC members are in charge of cybersecurity, and some of them are in charge of network security. Yet the security aspects related to our critical infrastructure, such as 5G, cannot be overlooked in our work. And what we do is try to construct an image on how the electronic communications ecosystem in Europe is addressing some of the challenges brought about by the security of 5G networks, including the new legal obligations. We don't do this isolated, but in cooperation with other institutions such as ENISA and the member states in the NIS cooperation group. Ladies and gentlemen, 2020 represents the year in which the Spectrum Awards process should be finalized for the 5G pioneers bands. But in reality, currently speaking, only 27% of the spectrum available for 5G has been awarded. Countries are at different stages in the rollout of 5G networks. There is a 5G commercial service in 18 EU members. We noticed that in some countries, the spectrum assignment process presented an opportunity to add security requirements for vertical. And there are a couple of hurdles that tends to slow down the 5G rollouts in Europe. Countries postponing their actions due to the discussion on security requirements, but now the COVID-19 pandemic and an increasing amount of disinformation regarding 5G and fears for emissions, for instance. So it is extremely important to realize that 5G is about opportunities and enabler in other solutions, smarter and more sustainable. With worldwide 5G revenue estimated at 225 billion in 2025, 5G is a key asset for Europe to compete in the global market. Now, about the toolbox, let me give you an overview of where we are now in the process. I think everyone here in this webinar is aware of the unforeseen political drive to adopt a concerted European approach to the security of 5G. Since the publication of the recommendation last year in March, member states started to take concrete actions and assess cybersecurity risks of 5G networks. In a joint collaboration, the member states have worked on a risk assessment on a national level that merged into a joint EU risk assessment. This exercise was unprecedented in the field of cybersecurity. Then, as the member states have issued a set of mitigation measures in January of this year, the Commission asked for a clear follow-up on the implementation of the EU toolbox. The 5G toolbox adopted in January has identified three categories of measures: strategic measures, technical measures, and supporting actions. For BEREC members, the strategic measures are the most relevant for any race works and experience. By May, member states had to report on the measures effectively implemented. And at this time, a second reporting is ongoing. It goes without saying that the implementation is part of a process of continuous improvement and needs to follow technological developments. Speaking from my own experience at the Belgian level, we are currently in the process of drafting a bill in order to implement the measures decided by Government of 5G and Security last summer. Throughout this process, BEREC is tasked with reporting on security issues related to 5G implementation. Now the focus of this group is to contribute in the field of our core competencies, such as its understanding of the impact of market regulation on competition, and will be drawing on the experience of its member NRAs. We assist to the development of the toolbox development process within the NIS cooperation group and the Commission, and we act as a conduit for information gathering in the domain of telecoms and share or experience on electronic communications market matters. Work is still ongoing, and we will continue this work throughout the process in close dialogue with other institutions and the sector, providing support. Currently, as we speak, BEREC is finalizing an internal report focusing on the issue of diversification of suppliers, which is one of the key measures in the 5G toolbox. The objective of this measure is obvious: implementing a working multi-vendor strategy should avoid or limit major dependency on a single supplier and should avoid dependency on suppliers considered to be high-risk vendors. In order to do that, we are assessing the current security level operators are thinking of and to which extent operators intend to adapt their policies in line with the 5G toolbox. In this prospect, it is crucial to understand the term multi-vendor strategy the same way and to have a correct overview of existing networks footprints in terms of suppliers per type of network and origin of the supplier. It should not come as a surprise, but we notice that risk requirements vary a lot from country to country, and the fragmentation in national initiatives can form a challenge for telecom operators to implement. That's why coordination and cooperation at EU level remains crucial. For many telecom players, it's a lot harder to find a forum to exchange views in a broader EU setting when it comes to cyber issues. That's, of course, where BEREC can play a role together with ENISA. I believe institutional cooperation on EU level at the level of public authorities will continue to be needed. Let me stress that the EU has already made significant progress in terms of developing a European cyber policy. The Cybersecurity Act was updated last year. The NIS directive is implemented, and the Electronic Communications Code will be implemented by the end of this year. Yet, a lot can still be done regarding the fragmented rules. So just to conclude, we will be actively supporting further work within the NIS cooperation group throughout the year at different stages. Depending on the toolbox development and any requirement that may arise, BEREC will continue to give its best effort to provide any further information in the form of internal reports. We contribute to this very important exercise, and we also in other domains related to 5G, such as the EMF issues. If we've learned one thing during the COVID pandemic, it's how crucial connectivity is within our society. Yet we should continue to build confidence in electronic communications services and especially new technologies. We should join forces if we want to make 5G a success story in Europe. With that, all the experience and initiative that will be shared today and in the coming Cyber Salon editions are very good for inspiration going forward. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion. I thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Francis.
Brilliant, Michelle. Thank you so much. So that's great. We've had a lovely setup for today's discussion. Lots of great things there. We've got spectrum to talk about, the choice of vendors, interinstitutional cooperation. This is all music to my ears. So with the foundations laid very nicely, I'd like to ask the other panelists to make 5, and I do really mean 5 minutes of introductory remarks each. And then we'll have a rummage in the toolbox. If you want to ask questions, you still can. You should see the box in the Slido app in front of you. We'll see those here and I can put them to the panel. Don't forget the hashtag, Cyber Salons, join in, share your thoughts. So Eva, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on what you just heard.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your kind introduction, and Michel for his very thoughtful presentation. Actually, I took note of many of the points you raised, Michel, because they're very, very relevant, and I wanted to address as well this salon is a perfect opportunity for us to engage also in discussion. As you have, Francis, kindly introduced me, I advise companies on the cybersecurity management. So I work with large companies, large organizations, usually with very high cybersecurity maturity, and I would like to bring this knowledge today to the discussion. So now Michel spoke about the benefits of 5G, and I have to agree with him. That is no question asked. We have to focus on the benefits. We have to reap these benefits. We need it for Europe. We need to modernize our economy, but we also need to find a way to stay competitive and to stay ahead of the game, if I can say, in the next industrial revolution. But of course, when we see this discussion going on in 5G for a few years now. Francis, you mentioned 4G was going on as well. What is different for 5G now is that we have apart from the inherent risk of any new technology that normally we don't know how it would work out, we are not always sure what stands behind, and it's typical for us as humans to fear the unknown. COVID is a perfect example. I know that this intervened in the 5G development to a certain extent, but we should take it also as a good practice to learn for our mistakes. We have faced a new virus. If we transfer this to technology, how do we handle this? Do we close down the economy for months? Yes, this could help for the virus, but it would have different implications for the rest of us, economy as well as personal well-being of humans. So how do we manage this inherent risk that is of unknown technology in this case in a balanced way? And I think the EU risk management approach and the toolbox is a good start. So it gives some practical steps. Okay, what are the different aspects we have to look at when we deal with 5G? We have concerns. They're linked to technology, they're linked to security, very disputed area where we now are more and more aware of the consequences if we don't get it right. Security of our infrastructure is key for everything, but also we have this new wave, wind of change, if you wish. We see how China is taking up a more significant role in providing quality products, and so we want to make sure that Europe remains competitive and relevant in this new technology introduction. Now, the 5G toolbox, this is part of the discussion today, but I very much like the focus which is on securing the 5G through diversification. Why diversification is so important from security perspective is first, there is no perfectly secure solution. So we know we have the security as much as our weakest link. We know vulnerabilities are constantly discovered. We have billions currently in very important, substantial technologies which undermine our economy and society. And so we would always have some kind of vulnerabilities to manage. But we have to also find a way to have a backup, to not rely on one big actor or player. We have to have the choice as well for companies to choose from different suppliers, which would again in the long term provide more competitive environment, would enable more innovation as well as provide more security when it comes to continuity of the sectors that would rely on 5G. But we know, okay, with this big reward comes big risk as well. What would typically companies do to manage the risk is to assess the risk by the mitigation measures, which are there's already a quite a long list of security best practices and measures that we could implement to secure those vulnerabilities that are persistent in network typically, but also what you would do eventually is you have to accept the residual risk. So this is part of risk management, and EU. It was part of my dissertation as well to look at the risk appetite of EU government sector. What I have found is that we are not that good yet in managing the risk. We are not good in accepting, okay, there is a remaining risk that we have to accept. And so with this, I would just like to see companies and organizations more involved in this discussion debate, where we objective is not to end up with very prescriptive regulatory framework where there's a little room for companies to bring their know-how. And as you know, companies take regulation as a Bible, right? There's a recommendation coming, whether from BEREC, from ENISA, European Commission, national governments, whatever it is, companies take it and implement it, no questions asked. And so with this, also the big responsibility for regulators to be aware of the implications there are. So I think I'm running over my 5 minutes, but I look forward to the discussion to maybe expand on this, on some of these points.
Brilliant, Eva. Thank you so much. Really interesting points there, especially about not putting all your eggs in one basket and the choice of vendors, and also with this point about that what regulators say. I mean, having written about the way that the GDPR was drawn up and then seen the next few years of people actually running around interpreting, implementing it. It's fascinating how these things unfold in the real world. So thinking about cybersecurity, about cryptography, and let's go to that side of things. Bart, do you want to tell us your thoughts on today's subject?
Thank you, Francis, and good morning, everybody. So I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for setting the scene and for clearly pointing out the challenges. Maybe I want to go back to the COVID-19 analogy. In fact, the last 7 months, I've been working very heavily on the Belgian Corona Alert app, so an app for proximity tracing. And I think we see analogies with what's happening at this front and what's happening in 5G. So that actually also there, Europe published a toolbox and some advice in March and April. In the end, they decided to have a common service, an interoperability gateway between all these apps. A few weeks ago, 3 countries went live. It will take us, I think, to Christmas before we have 16 or 17 countries live. If you now take a step back, I think the good news is we had very good European collaboration. In the end, we managed to actually get a European-wide system. But if you look at all the effort and time spent, if the countries would have aligned from the beginning and made one app together, I think we would have been much faster, much more effective, and we would have had a better solution. So I think it's a bit the same in 5G. As the other speakers mentioned, it's no longer about network security. This is a critical component of society. It's our factories, our hospitals, our transportation systems. So we can't really afford that things go wrong there. It's not like, oh, it's a nuisance, we have no network anymore. If there is attacks on this, this is affecting the core of our society, the core of our economy. And so for this, I'm very pleased that the EU has understand that this is a very important challenge and has taken action. I'm happy to see the toolbox. I'm happy to see the risk analysis. But as an academic, I still think it's too little, too late. And for example, when I was reading through the status report, I had a sentence like, information can be too sensitive to shared. So member states still have this idea that they have their own national security. There is the global security of the EU ecosystem. And well, we know about some weaknesses, some attacks, some problems, but we're not going to tell other member states because this is too risky for our own security. And as a citizen, as an academic, I'm very concerned about this. I do understand the concern and understand the background of this. But I think if it is the approach we go to 5G security, I think it may end up in a disaster because it's a very complex system. It's technology which is very different from what we had before. And if there is no collaboration, I think we may end up with big problems. For example, one member state knowing about the problem and not telling the others, and then getting an attack that actually affects the whole of Europe. So the trends or the difficulties are in clarification. The fact that in networking, we call this virtualized network functions. More or less, we move from the simple hardware blocks to more complex software blocks, which are much more flexible. So it makes everything much more elastic and configurable. On the other hand, it presents major security challenges. And in general, complexity is the enemy of security and privacy. And so we're actually making those communication systems much more complex. So we actually also have to invest much more in security and privacy. Another theme you read in the toolbox is about open certification. It's of course very important, but how do you audit such a complex system? How do you certify a complex system? We do have good experiences, still with mistakes, and still at very high costs of certifying things like smart cards. In the communication sector, it would be a SIM or an eSIM. But as soon as the system become more complex, we have a very big problem. For example, none of us is using a certified operating system. Yet, what we want to do is we say we're going to certify our telecommunication infrastructure. And in fact, those networks, components, these functions will become software boxes within operating systems with virtual machines on top, which are again have operating systems. So we're going to build a much more complex system, and then we put our hopes in certification, while the state-of-the-art certification is that we cannot yet do this. So when I look at the risk analysis, again, I applaud that the risk analysis has been done, and I think it's very good to have such an analysis where we can all look at what the risks are and evaluate how we should mitigate them. I think excellent work has been done there by all the actors. There is one risk I am missing, which is mass surveillance by nations, which are the nation itself, maybe the friendly nations and the not so friendly nations. So there is a focus on suppliers and suppliers from not so friendly nations that may subvert the system, but there is no risk considered of mass surveillance by the country itself, by the member state or by other member states of each other. And I think we do know that these things are happening, and they become more of a concern because 5G will be part of our lives and will be much more intrusive than just a communication network where we talk. So I think this is still a problem for Europe, that of course national security is outside their scope, but I think it's very important because on the one hand, we have the European Court of Justice saying that mass surveillance, massive collection of metadata is violating human rights. On the other hand, we look at new 5G networks, which are much more intrusive, and their surveillance and legal access is actually not being looked at as a risk, because as soon as you have legal access or access by intelligence services, you actually open a potential backdoor that can be abused by third parties. And there is actually, maybe it's a very technical problem, but in fact, it's very simple. When will we have end-to-end encrypted calls on 5G? Today, if I want an end-to-end encrypted call, I can use Signal, I can use Telegram, I can send secure end-to-end messages over WhatsApp. But if I send an SMS or I make a call on 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G, there is no end-to-end encryption, which means that the message or the call is unclear in the network, can be, of course, intercepted by police forces with a warrant, but of course can also be intercepted by anybody hacking the network. And so this is still an item that is completely off the table. It's not being mentioned at all. It's being ignored. It's the elephant in the room. But I think this is actually something we should also look at. And then finally, there has been a lot of debate on supply chain risks and the risk of backdoors or remote access. And so my answer there is we should much more look at transparency and openness and have open systems. If we look at the big cloud infrastructures, I guess you all know the big players, the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, they actually run on Linux, which is an open source software developed for Unix, but then developed in Europe. They actually use TLS for communication. Again, it's an open standard, and there is OpenSSL or boarding SSL. There is open source libraries. Even more so, the cloud infrastructure we use for software uses open hardware. The hardware we have as consumers is closed. We don't know the specs, we don't know the details, but on the cloud side, the operators of the cloud have written specs for open hardware so that actually anybody can compete, and anybody can also verify whether there is problems or issues with the hardware. And so I think it's a bit strange that if you look at the cloud world, their I'm not saying everything is open. Of course, the software is still proprietary. The software that makes the cloud run, this is the business asset of these companies. But if you look at the lower layers of the stack, the hardware, the operating system, the communications infrastructure, security infrastructure, everything is open source. Well, actually, if you look at 5G, we see the opposite. While I think both will be equally important for our society. So I think there should be a much bigger push for open source rather than believing that the problem will be solved by having more than one vendor. And I think if you have open source, you can actually check for vulnerabilities and you can, in a timely way, fix them and resolve them yourself as a community effort. That's why I want to end. Also, I think this toolbox is a great example of collaboration, but I don't think it's enough. If we really want to get secure systems and secure 5G network, I think Europe should be to put them together. Member states should be pooling hundreds of experts who do actually together audits of specific building blocks, specific components, and work on certification. I think if you have such kind of teams of hundreds of people, then you can make progress. If every member state puts a few people or a few dozen of people and they all duplicate each other's work, I don't think we're going to arrive there. And I think especially if these people would work towards open components, I think the benefits could be shared by all without the risk of having backdoors or having one member state knowing of vulnerability and not telling the other one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Fascinating. Lots to think about there. I mean, Michelle touched on the idea that as we allocate this spectrum, that's a chance to improve security. So a kind of real vision of how far we could go with that, talking about encryption. And again, this idea that, how meaningful is it having a union of all these diverse member states if you then decide not to share with each other and keep your secrets preciously guarded in a corner. Brilliant. Adrian, let me come to you now. Why don't you tell us a bit about standards and about your work at 3GPP?
Yes, thank you, Francis, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this cyber salon. Building on what Fartas just said, we hear it many times, 5G isn't like any previous generation. Previous generations were really very sort of consumer-centric, where 5G, the business opportunities really lie in the industrial sectors, in enterprises, and indeed right into the infrastructure of our country. And if we consider some of those sectors like the financial industry, the health industry, autonomous driving, factors of the future, I mean, these have very bespoke and specific security demands. Now, the design criteria for 5G from the very outset was secure by default, meaning that from the design point of view, this wasn't something which was added after the other engineering tasks had been completed. It was a thread that was running through from end to end of every facet of the 5G design process. That said, each sector being served does have its specific security demands, and the first step really is to understand those demands and see where the threat vectors really lie. And this has been extensively worked in bodies such as ETSI and 3GPP, and I think now we do at least have a better understanding of the security demands for these industry sectors in 5G. Now, we know there's widespread agreement that standardization is at the center of network security. We've heard that and we've seen that many times stated. But it doesn't end there. The standards which are meticulously drafted then need to be meticulously implemented and deployed. Once they're deployed, those networks need to be meticulously operated. So while standardization is a very good starting point, it's a good first step, it's only the beginning, and it certainly isn't the end of the story. And I think that only if we have a combination of all three of those aspects, secure standardization, secure product development deployment, and then secure network operations, will we achieve our objective. Because ultimately we can only be as secure as our weakest link. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Short and sweet. Okay, but lots to think about, particularly with this question of standardization and how closely aligned those standards are, which brings us on very nicely to I suppose coming back to Michelle. If we could circle back to you for what you've heard in terms of both the concerns people have about consistency and things like that, And also I've got a couple of questions from the floor, which I'd love it if any of you were able to weigh in on, but I suppose Michelle might be the person with the most insights. So I've got one anonymous question. Obviously you can't do that at a real life event. Would like to know, there's going to be a BEREC internal report. Sure. When will it be finalised, and how does it link to EC diversification and the Open RAN study conducted by DG Connect? And this one, I suppose we can all kind of have a go at this one, but somebody, again, anonymously, wants to know about the EU Toolbox guidance report and the definition of detailed restrictions, high-risk vendors. Great. So, Michelle, why don't we come back around to you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Frances. I cannot speak on behalf of the European Commission, of course, but just let me give you an overview of what we are doing now with this internal report. We had a kind of information gathering exercise running during last summer, where we gathered input from different stakeholders, being our own members, NRAs, but also associations, vendors, and MNO, just to have a kind of snapshot of the existing mobile networks, and just to answer the question whether or not they use one or more than one supplier, and what they intend to do for 5G, and what they are already doing with the existing 5G networks. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, 18 European countries have now commercial services, and so this is still ongoing, and this will give us a clear overview on the market. But for the other question, I think it's better to ask the Commission itself. I have no view on that. And this exercise will be ended by the end of this year, to answer the first question.
Brilliant. Always nice to have a deadline, although I feel they're even more of a shifting target than you than ever in the current environment, where you just never know what happens. It's very interesting how several of you've highlighted the similarity of the pandemic and cybersecurity questions. I mean, I've been using the UK's contact tracing app, which I don't know how many of you know about this, has a terrifying glitch where you get a kind of ghost notification. It pops up, it says you've been exposed to somebody with COVID-19. You click on the notification, there's nothing there. Like the notification disappears. There's no record of the notification having landed in the app, and you're stuck. I mean, the first time it happened to me, I was just panicking. I was like, what's happened? Where's it gone? So eventually I found a news story about this issue, but it's I suppose, and it turned out, well, what I read was that it was the way that it syncs with the back end in certain version of Android, but also some Apple things, where it's basically kind of checking it. It's basically should say your app is working, you're being traced, but instead it says you've been exposed. So what a UI, and the slightly long rambling point that I'm trying to make is about false positives, about how worried people should actually be. And about, I guess, there's been a lot of hype about these high-risk vendors, about core and non-core network, about what we can actually let people have access to. And as Adrian pointed out, you are only as strong as your weakest link. So if what we need is a kind of consistent pan-European approach, do people think, and we'll probably do quite quick answers on this, that the toolbox is on its way to achieving that? Eva, what do you think?
Right, it is. Can you hear me now? It is just the starting point. Thanks, Michelle. The starting point for getting there. The first exercise was done indeed to go through whole Europe, so all member states coming and doing the same exercise at the same moment on the same topic. With this, we would get results that obviously they would differ depending on the maturity of, okay, how much we know about security in these member states, on the how much we want to share, as Bart was mentioning, of information. But at least we get the picture of, okay, who is there, what are the, let's say, the confidentiality, sensibility issues we have to tackle, and we have some kind of an overview that everyone would be on the same page of what are the risks, what are we fighting, right? So unless you know what you are addressing, what you are fighting, you won't know which specific measure to implement. But of course, this won't be enough, and now we have to walk the talk and to act in the consistent and coordinated way. And for this, we need to continue to share. We need to build the trust, maybe between member states, for them at least internally to have this information, full transparency and shared. But we are not there yet. We're not there yet.
Perfect, great. And I can see that the floor really appreciating this annual discussion, because I've got loads of questions popping up. So I think we might build on that to discuss a bit more about. I think everybody's mentioned that the toolbox seems to be a kind of regulatory technical response to what are really quite political motivations. So do you think this toolbox approach could be useful in other areas in future? I guess, Professor, how do you feel about the way of having the toolbox? Do you worry that politicians are kind of getting their hands all over that what should be a pure technical question of how this is done?
No, and I do think actually this is a more political question than a technical question. But it seems that when Europe doesn't have the competence to make decisions and they go for a toolbox, a soft approach where at least they achieve convergence, which I think is a good way, because it would also, I would be disappointed if we just throw the hands up in the air and say we can't do this. So I think it's a good way to take steps. But then I guess my question is, what are the next steps, and can we then actually move ahead? And for example, how can we remove barriers so that member states don't want to share information? I think as a technical person, I can give more input on the core versus access network question. I think it's actually, again, related to this very tricky question of end-to-end encryption, because if you have end-to-end encryption, which goes from device to device, supported by the network, and it's properly done, well, then actually who's messing with your core is only an availability problem. So you can actually have redundancy with multiple players, but in fact, there is no sensitive information in the network. If you protect metadata, which is even more important, if you protect it properly, in fact, then you're less vulnerable as well. So I think it's a very interesting trade-off to be made. If we add more security to the network, we will be less vulnerable. But of course, if you add features like legal access, where a third party, say police or intelligence services, are added to this, this of course also makes your core more vulnerable to not friendly nation states being added themselves a third party to conversations. So I think it's actually, I think, again, the elephant in the room, which is not being mentioned, is you first have to decide how much protection you want to give to the user of the network, that actually decides how big your risk is. If you make your network very vulnerable or usable to intelligence and police forces, it becomes much more vulnerable. And this debate I don't see or hear. This seems to be something that cannot be mentioned.
Perfect. Michelle.
Yes, may I just intervene? And I fully agree with Bart that there are a lot of concerns raised by new technologies, as he mentioned in his own introductory remarks. Concerns related to privacy and the use of data, of course, are dealt within another kind of framework, and we have to think about the draft e-privacy regulation now that for years has been tried to be put in place, but this is a very, very political issue, and that's not easy for the co-legislature to land on this and to find an agreement, as you know. Second, there is the use of data, what Bart referred to, and you may remember that years ago after the bombing in London and in Madrid, there was a directive related to data retention. But unfortunately, this directive has been cancelled by the Court of Justice. And in the time being, we are in a kind of legal vacuum where indeed we would like to know what can be done, and especially what can authorities like police do with data, and what are the obligations, the legal obligations of operators. And maybe for that there is a need for a new legal European instrument. And I think that this is not what the Toolbox is addressing. So I understand both skepticism and disappointment, but related to these items, I think that there are other frameworks needed for that. Over to you, Franz.
Great. Adrian, you had a few technical issues earlier, but I think that you're fully back with us now. So perhaps if you would like to come on in this and maybe talk a little bit about the role that standards could play in
Yes, fine. Can you just check, is my audio okay? Is my audio
yes,
okay?
We can hear you. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I think we have to separate the issues because, of course, we have different regulatory regimes which prevail around the world. You have a central sort of standardization system that's trying to build one unique system to meet global markets. And that global design has to satisfy the regulatory requirements which are different in different regions of the world. Not only are those regulations different, but they're changing from one year to the next. So the driving point is within the standardization regime is always from an industrial push. So you need to have members of standards bodies coming forward and proposing what they believe are solutions to existing problems. And to take Mark's point on end-to-end encryption, that would have to start with a consensus agreement among the industry that was the right direction to go. If you get that consensus agreement and that is the right direction to go, then the standards will be written. On the other hand, the other push could be from a regulatory side, where if the regulations in a particular region said you shall have end-to-end encryption, then it would be incumbent on the standards bodies to meet that regulatory requirement. So you've got both a sort of a bottom-up push and a top-down push, and then on a case-by-case basis, it's a matter of deciding which is the most effective approach.
Great. So we should end up with a kind of perfect Goldilocks middle where we all feel safe, things are speedy and efficient, and we should come back to this later. We actually get to use all the amazing things that 5G is for, because we need to talk about things like quantum and AI as well. But let's talk about a bit more about infrastructure. They've got a question from the floor here, which is, I think comparing 5G security with Signal/Telegram/WhatsApp security is misleading. 5G is underlying infrastructure, whereas messaging clients are the apps on top. I mean, this takes me right back to my time at the Wall Street Journal with the discussion about in the wake of all the NSA stuff, should there be backdoors, who can see what, and as a kind of side point to this, how meaningful are any measures taken by one member state when we live in a truly interconnected world? Where are your servers? The whole point of electronic communications is that they're electronic and we can ping them all over the world. So I guess with that huge tangled ball of cryptographic string, we should come back to the professor. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Maybe two quick comments. There was also a question at which risk analysis I was referring to, the EU coordinated risk assessment of the cybersecurity of 5G network report by the NIST coordination group. This is 9th of October 2019. You can find this online. So as a cryptographer, indeed, I keep finding myself in this crypto debate for almost 30 years. This is coming, and in fact, it's never gone away. I mean, it came with us in 1993, the Clipper chip, and we're still debating it. And my biggest problem is there is never a debate, because there is not really one side arguing strongly and giving the evidence why we actually would need this backdoor access. I mean, we never get data, facts, and figures. What we do see is that, for example, an increasing number of police forces have access to mobile phone data. So they actually configure phone or can remotely hack phones. So in fact, access at network level becomes less relevant because in fact, police forces are having much more intrusive technologies and having access to end devices which don't contain our communication, but our whole life, including health data, including our social life, including our professional life. So I think it's a much broader debate that, in fact, one side doesn't want to put on the table which information they have, and then they start debating encrypted communication, which I think is a red herring. It's not the real problem. It's the global access to communications. So now to debate infrastructure to Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp is misleading. Well, of course, they're separate things. There is applications, there is a network. On the other hand, if I subscribe to a telephone company, I get a phone service. And this is a service offered by the telephone company. And I would like to have an end-to-end encrypted call. In fact, my call is encrypted until the base station controller in 3G and 4G. But then the encryption stops. And so it's very strange that if I pay for a service, I just use the normal service on my phone, then I have no end-to-end encryption. If I install an app to get me exactly the same service, the delivery is different, the supplier is different, but as a user, the experience is the same. I just dial a number or I click on an icon and I get a connection. I can get an end-to-end connection. I think for SMS, the likeliness is even bigger, right? I mean, whether I send an SMS or a WhatsApp message, the user experience is the same, I would say, in the sense of maybe WhatsApp is fancier, but SMS is sending a message. Well, in one case, it's encrypted. In the other case, it's not. And so there is, of course, a very big debate on access. It focuses mostly on access to communication, but then only for the one offered by the telcos. It doesn't focus enough on, I think, access to the end systems. It doesn't focus enough on access to metadata, because metadata is very vulnerable or is very rich in information. It can actually leak a lot of sensitive private data. And it does affect the whole debate. I think I do agree it's regulated in the e-privacy directive for regulation that we'll soon hopefully have, but it's also affecting this debate because the architecture and the security in our networks also affects what the impact is of the vulnerability of a specific 5G building block. If the basic communication service is end-to-end encrypted, you're much less vulnerable to individual components being hacked by a foreign nation state. And I think it's a very complex global problem, and we really have to have the global debate and not having individual debates separately. But I do agree that, of course, 5G is an infrastructure, but on top of it, the telco players are still offering services, and I think they should also have the right security level.
Brilliant. Bart, thank you so much. Perfect. So this is good. So I think we've talked a lot about encryption, about this kind of issue now, but as you mentioned, everything's secure until it gets to the base station. So the first Open RAN base station was recently built in the UK. It's over by the border in Wales. And it might be interesting to talk a little bit more about hardware now. So we can talk about the sort of pros and cons of the Open RAN approach. I've got a question from the floor that feeds into this, which says, will we end up with a bottleneck situation with proprietary set-top boxes? Is it just a matter of competition? You know, does this literally just come back down to commercial decisions? And I think it'd be really interesting to hear a bit from Michelle and Eva on this, because Eva, you obviously advise companies who are making these kind of decisions. So it would be great to hear about how you advise them making those decisions, whether you think that they are taking cyber seriously, and then Michelle, we might come back to you for a bit of thoughts on the open source approach. Eva.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for this question. Indeed, it links to what Bart was saying about the security. So why do a typical operator has to stop security at some point? Because it has the message was passed already at the base station. And I think the question really that we have to deal with today is how confident we are in our capacity of our infrastructure and in general, anyone in Europe to build security, to enable and to guarantee the level of security that we are comfortable with. And this is a big question. It goes much beyond 5G, but of course 5G as the underlying infrastructure is the one that brings all these different sectors and industries and IoT world together, and we need to to focus on this. How do we increase the security of every endpoint? How do we increase the security of every critical infrastructure, right? So we worry about the hospitals, that they would be on 5G. But do we, can we confidently say that they're secure enough, even without a 5G, with their hardware, software, and communications? So I think from security perspective, there's a lot of best practices, and there's the leading companies in the field, but majority of our economy is not there yet. So we need to work to give them the tools, but also to ask the right questions for them to go to a more secure operations.
Brilliant. And Michelle, I mean, in a way, the toolbox, all this discussion of high-risk vendors, if all of the infrastructure looks the same and anybody can do it and we all run our own systems over the top, surely that takes a lot of complicated things out of the equation.
Yeah, yes, of course. But let me say maybe a few words on this open RAN approach you were referring to 2 minutes ago, Francis. So just basically, what is it about? So for the sake of clarity, RAN stands for Radio Access Network. And for the time being, all this discussion about this 5G toolbox is about vendors, and the vendors of this world are a very limited group. It's Nokia, it's Ericsson, it's Huawei, ZTE, and somehow Samsung. Those are the big five, if you like. And the open RAN approach is different, of course. It's in contrast to what we can consider as a kind of black box RAN technology. This would allow to combine the equipment from different RAN software and hardware manufacturers based on the open and interoperable interface. And so, of course, this approach could address different objectives, but most notably to increase competition and cost efficiencies and reduce dependency on these different vendors. Is this the way forward for security? So that's a big question because you don't depend on just one supplier, but maybe you need different supplier. And so if you need to fix a security issue, maybe it's not so easy. So there is a kind of skepticism for the time being from operators in general terms to follow that path. And I don't say that's not the way forward. I just say that for the time being, it's difficult to foresee what will come in the next 2 or 3 years to come. And this is also a question of scalability. Will these companies which provide open RAN approaches able to provide a large market to provide MNOs? That's a big question too. So for the time being, I think it's too soon to draw any conclusion on that. Over to you, Francis.
Perfect. So I guess we'll all come around for a quick one-word answer before we move on to thinking a bit more about the future. But I've got a lovely question from the floor here. The example of COVID apps is good. In 5G, what is the biggest risk? Miss out on enabling technology or rely on suppliers from countries like the USA and China? Oh, that's a crunchy one, isn't it? So if you all, let's go around quickly and see what you all think, and then we'll move on to thinking about the future. Professor, which side of that risk would you rather be?
Well, I think in this case, of course, for the COVID-19 apps in most EU countries, we actually rely on the Google Apple exposure notification interface. But there is quite some push, I think still not enough push to open up this interface and to show the code. Google has shown part of this code. So I think if you can push the vendors to open the code, I don't think there's such a big problem where the vendor is coming from. And maybe we should change the business models and say, if it's critical for our society, we want open solutions. And then this debate of who's a supplier will actually become a very different debate. You don't no longer depend on black boxes. I think on the other hand, of course, this has pointed out the problem of Europe, that we technology is very dependent on other nations. We should actually work on our sovereignty there. And as I keep repeating it, one way to achieve it is having open solutions, hopefully also open European solutions, but it's much easier to integrate open solutions from competing nations if they're transparent and open. Then you can deal with problems yourself. You can actually see what's happening with the data, what's happening with security problems, are they being resolved? So I don't think it's a miracle solution to everything, but I think it's a step in the right direction where you reframe the debate from should I choose country A or country B? You just say, let's have an open solution where we can all contribute and all assess the security and then make the risk assessment.
Brilliant. That was a lot more than one word, but they were all really good words. Adrian, what do you think about this?
On the COVID side, I agree. It's a good example. On the COVID side, I think it is a good example because it demonstrates how we were caught off guard. We had a demand coming for a service we hadn't anticipated, and the response to that was, well, it took an awful long time even to try and agree a course and direction. So I think there's a lesson to be learned here that as we go forward with 5G, we don't know who's going to be the end beneficiary of the service. We don't really know how that network is going to be deployed. And then if we marry this into the discussion on Open RAN, you don't know how that generation is going to evolve over time either. So we have an understanding of what 5G looks like today, but 5G in 10 years' time could look quite different. If we look at previous generations and how they evolved over a decade or so, and we need to be prepared for all sorts of changes in architectural design. We need to be able to change for unforeseen use cases like the COVID case here, and be able to move and adapt quickly and service them.
Perfect. So we should be open-minded. Eva?
I would like to chip in on this discussion because it's indeed, we need to learn to manage change, right? To manage the unknown and to manage the risks. And this doesn't come with specific, the toolbox, perhaps it's our way of starting to approach this at European level, but we need to build also this resilience in society to manage the change. It would come more quickly and more often. And to have this, I see here the question, earlier question about how boards are seeing cyber risks. To have this resilience, you have to have it everywhere across your organization and everywhere across your society, if we speak at European level. And so with COVID, maybe we have seen that the focus is more on cyber, so it's bigger concern than ever. Why? Because most of, well, all of us now are online, so all the business that is happening in our economy is happening online. Not to mention the private conversation, the government conversation, everything is happening through some kind of a platform. So there's a high cost of the security, and there's let's say more interest to attack, but also more at stake for us to protect. And this has also put at board level the question of, okay, how do we deal with cybersecurity, potential liability? Maybe it's not yet that much addressed, but we have seen in the recent months, you see CEO being charged for a cyber incident that was mishandled for data breach. So we would see more and more this debate at the corporate level.
Brilliant. And then Michelle, briefly, if you have thoughts on this.
Sorry, Francis, I didn't hear.
Oh, perfect. Sorry. So Michelle, I guess before we move on to talking about the future, what you think about whether the biggest risk is missing out on this opportunity, or relying on suppliers from not non-EU. Which side of that particular risk would be, which side it would be worth to fall on? The question from the floor.
Okay, but again, I don't think that's this the, the the reason why this 5G toolbox was set up is related to a specific country. I think that there is uh, a high requirement on security in itself. And of course, we know that the elephant in the room is the commercial struggle between China and the US. That's for sure. But even without this backdrop, we would need such an instrument. So I don't think that this is related to one specific country. I don't think so.
Brilliant. Perfect. Right. We should move on a bit because time is ticking on and think about the future. So in the July review, there was a mention of maintaining eye on future technologies. We should take a moment to have a little think about how Europe forged ahead at the beginning of mobile phone technology too, right? They were in there, it was the standards that made it all happen. Everybody has a fond reminisce about their first Nokia, hooray for the 3310, etc. So how can we get back to that position, right? Talking about the supremacy, the US are getting very excited about that. AI, I mean, machine learning, like that's already here and that's very real. What comes next when we get to what people think of as true AI? For a start, none of these things can actually work without 5G, but how can Europe position itself to get back that amazing position? Michelle, why don't we come to you first on this one?
Yes, but again, you know that there is this question also raised by Bart about sovereignty, and it's for sure that there is a need for Europe to become independent from a technological point of view. And I think that's what we will trying to achieve, and even if this 5G toolbox is not the wonder remedy to anything, to any trouble and any problems we need to address. I think that we go in the right direction with this kind of cooperation. Let's not forget that security is still a national competence of each member state, and I think that is in this debate we have shown during the last 2 years a very good cooperation at European level, and I think that's also what about stressed in this intervention, that this is the way forward. That's what I think.
Great. Adrian, if you want to put this is more of a 3GPP hat question.
Yeah, I sort of question the question really, because what does European sovereignty actually mean in this context? I mean, what actually is a European country or a European company? I mean, okay, I guess Ericsson we would say is European, but is Nokia European? Or and what about those global players who have thousands of employees working in Europe? By definition, are they European? Or because on the other hand, I would also say that I don't necessarily subscribe to the fact that Europe is behind the lead here. If you look at how 5G was developed, most of the content that ended up in the 5G standard was the result of R&D projects funded by the EU through massive R&D programs. And looking to the future, I suspect the European leaders will try and do exactly that again. They will make sure that the R&D, where it all starts, takes place first in Europe. And we've been very, very successful in doing that in previous generations. I don't see why we can't do it in future generations. But again, I get rather confused by this idea of sovereignty and what that actually means in the terms of industrial companies and where they're actually headquartered or where they're doing their work.
Great. And do you think that with the toolbox is going to help Europe be ready to kind of be competitive on things like AI, on things like quantum? Is it doing enough in the right direction?
I mean, it's certainly helping. But again, if you look at what comes out of European academia, we've got some of the best universities in the world who are doing research into quantum. I mean, Europe is very well ahead in terms of its understanding of quantum and the quantum threat. And bodies like ETSI, who have probably one of the most successful standardization approaches to quantum and quantum threats, is evidence of that. So, I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much and say that we're behind the wave here. I think Europe is actually in a very strong position with the academia and R&D we have, and the close links between academia, R&D, and the standardization.
Right. Well, there's a glowing endorsement of the work that Europe's academics are doing. So, Professor, do you feel everything's as rosy as Adrian describes?
Well, let me first say that I don't think we should go back in nostalgia and look back at security of GSM or Airbus. I think the world has changed. And I do think we have very good academics in Europe. We have also great research programs like the ERC program. I don't think that the other framework programs actually have already adapted to circumstances. I think they're still in a world in which technology takes 5 to 7 years to develop, which is probably the case in chemistry and medical world. In the IT world, this 5 to 7 year horizon, and then claiming to do practical stuff, I think there is a mismatch between the research horizon from the program and the research and the reality. And so I think we should take a step back and redefine the research. I think the ERC approach is very good. Just fund the best people with fundamental research, just don't direct what they do. And then there is more the DARPA approach, the US approach, which is much more goal-oriented. And in fact, some of my colleagues are working on DARPA because it's much more, we see more the results. It's much more tuned to the modern times and how things happen in IT. I think that's where Europe should reorient its research funding in those two directions. I think in technology, we're in a very difficult times in the sense that, of course, it's all about scale, and we're a bit smaller than China, and I guess we don't have the same resources because of the fragmentation. We still have our national research centers, and there is like there's still not an integrated approach. In that sense, it's the same as in defense. We're actually much less efficient. But I think where we do have an edge is in what we should do is embed European values in our technology. Technology is entering our lives very, very closely. It's no longer about just who you call or whether you can call on the road. It's really part of our life. And I think the real challenge for us is, can we use our R&D effectively to reflect our European values in our systems? Because otherwise, the nations who build the systems will impose their values on us. And I think this is the core societal debate. And I think Europe has the capability of doing it if we collaborate and if we work with open systems. I think this is the very interesting challenge is if we have open systems, and on the other hand, we respect privacy and we can make the right mix of this, I do think we can use our technology and our research to actually create the society we want, and not a society which happens to come because technology is imposed on us.
Oh, I mean, that's the kind of all-encompassing philosophy. That's a great note to come near to the end on. So I'm going to take one last question from the floor, and then I will come to the panelists for some concluding thoughts. So I've got a question from the floor. Should end-to-end encryption services be part of a universal service to protect users' access and data? Universal service obligation question. Let's Barrett Gold. Michelle, what do you think?
Thank you, Francis. I think that we have to bear in mind that the philosophy of universal service is that nobody has to be left behind, and that's about connectivity. And so that is an instrument that can be helped for people without connection, and it is not related to data security or privacy issues. So I don't think there is a link between both. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. Very diplomatically put. Excellent. Right. I feel like we've gone for a bit of a free range ramble today. I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has too. But coming back to the actual title of the session was Improving Diversity of Supply and Securing the 5G Environment. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists for kind of a minute of concluding thoughts on whether supply is diverse enough, their kind of takeaway from this of what we might have seen in the October responses to the Toolbox, which of course, hopefully we might see sometime soon, who knows, and kind of where they see this whole thing going next. So how shall we, Eva, I have you first again.
Thank you. So coming back to the title, whether we're diverse enough, I personally don't think so. We could do better, but for this we need to we need to work on the capacity, right? On the building those champions that could deliver, that could chip in, and that could create more choice, that could create more secure solutions, and that could also work as a backup. And if we look at the way ahead, okay, this is the topic we often discuss, the sovereignty, and for me this is indeed the capacity to deliver, as well as the strategic partnership. And this is a point we should not forget. We should not close ourselves in our little home, because we still need to use and to work together to improve the global connected
exactly.
world. Right?
We live in a very interconnected world, and it's only going to get more so. Adrian, what are your takeaways from today? I'm sorry, we have some connectivity issues with you.
Sorry, you still have connection issues?
Yeah, you're just a bit echoey, but it's fine. We can hear.
Okay, good. I think it's worth noting that as of August this year, there were 80 suppliers of 5G products. So we already have quite a diverse range of product manufacturers in the 5G market, and that number is going to grow and grow and grow over the time. If we follow Bart's path in going more and more towards open systems, you'll see many, many more vendors entering the market, because it really enables them and encourages them to do so. But having a larger supply chain itself will pose further problems. Interoperability, which is the key attribute which we really need in 5G, becomes far more complex the more players you have in it. So while at the moment we have a small number of large suppliers, achieving interoperability across systems has been largely successful. If you were to multiply that supply chain by 10, then you really have to consider what are the implications with regard to interoperability.
Brilliant. Bart, sorry, Professor. Casual.
I think it's clear that competition is very good. Nobody wants monopolies, and I think in other areas of ICT we see the risk of having these monopolies or de facto monopolies, and I think we're trying to fight this. But I think we do have, I agree, we do have 5 players in the 5G market, 5 large ones. I think we should make sure we have a level playing ground, and I think my proposal is to shift, and I think I'm repeating myself, to shift the debate on sovereignty towards the debate on openness. And if actually the systems are open, I think then there is not a debate who delivered the systems. I think we have to then think, how is the business model? How do we reward people for their contribution? This is different in open systems, but it seems to work in some other settings. So maybe we should think more about the business models than trying to think of creating European champions to play the same games that the other guys are playing. We should all have everybody compete on a level playing ground with open systems. I think then we can solve many problems.
Brilliant. So big open systems with nice secure messages within them. That's a vision we can all get on board with. And Michelle, we'd like to wrap things up for us.
Okay, thank you very much. So just let me remind you that as an organization grouping telco regulators, cybersecurity is not our core business. Having said that, we have set up an ad hoc working group for this, for the reason I explained. And as far as we can see, and of course, Eva is right, we always can do better in terms of diversification. But in the first results of the snapshot we have, it seems that there is a very high level of awareness which has been raised thanks to this toolbox and other instruments. So what I'm going to say is that I think that we are going to the right direction, but of course we haven't achieved our goals yet, and there are so many things to be done. That's true. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So huge thank you to all of our panelists, to everyone who joined us. Do keep the discussion going, and hopefully we'll see you again soon at the next Forum Europe Cybersecurity Salon. Thank you so much for your time. Brilliant. Bye. Thanks.